François-Marie Arouet was born in Paris in 1694. His father, a well-established lawyer, sent him to the best school in the capital, and by all accounts he was a brilliant student. The young Arouet decided at an early age to make his name as a writer, or rather to remake his name, as the first thing he did was to change this name to Voltaire. The 18th century is often referred to as the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment, but sometimes more fairly simply as the Age of Voltaire. So changing his name was a good call. The Age of Arouet would just not have worked quite as well. Voltaire was precociously talented as a poet. At the age of only 24, he had his first verse tragedy performed at the Comédie Française. By then, he'd already begun work on an epic poem about the French religious civil wars of the 16th century, glorifying Henry IV as the king who brought peace by pragmatically converting from Protestantism to Catholicism. This was to be a subject dear to Voltaire's heart, for under the guise of writing a national epic, he was dwelling at length on the bloody consequences of religious intolerance. Right from the start, Voltaire's views on religion were expressed robustly. He was not an atheist, in part because he thought that some minimal belief in a deity was useful for social cohesion. Voltaire's God had created the world, instilled in us a sense of good and evil, and then basically taken a back seat. This was known as rational religion, or in the 18th century called natural religion or deism, and it had no truck with metaphysics of any kind. Voltaire was basically a man of reason who loathed fanaticism, idolatry, and superstition. That men can kill each other to defend some bit of religious doctrine which they scarcely understand is something he found repellent, and he reserved his greatest hatred for the clerics who exploited the credulity of believers to maintain their own power base. Voltaire wanted religion, but not the church. For obvious reasons, the Catholic authorities were not keen for Voltaire's poem about Henry IV, La Henriade, to be published in France. So Voltaire decided to go and publish it in London instead, and in 1726 went and travelled to England. What began as a business trip soon turned, however, into something quite different, and Voltaire ended up staying in England for some 2.5 years. He learnt to speak English fluently, got to know writers and politicians, and became a great admirer of English Protestant culture. He decided to write a book about his experience of England, and the Letters Concerning the English Nation appeared first in English in 1733. The French authorities were horrified. The book was censored, and Voltaire only narrowly avoided prison. That's because the book presented an informal portrait of English culture in a witty and ironical style, looking in turn at religion, politics, science, and literature, in ways that were critical, implicitly, of French culture and politics. Here, for example, is how Voltaire presents the Royal Exchange, a handsome building in the heart of the City of London where merchants from across the world would meet to transact business. "Take a view of the Royal Exchange," Voltaire wrote, "where the representatives of all nations meet for the benefit of mankind. There the Jew, the Mahometan, and the Christian transact together as though they all profess the same religion and give the name of infidel to none but bankrupts. There the Presbyterian confides in the Anabaptist, and the Churchman depends on the Quaker's word. At the breaking up of this pacific and free assembly, some will withdraw to the synagogue, and others to take a glass. This man goes and is baptized in a great tub in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. That man has his son's foreskin cut off, while a set of Hebrew words, quite unintelligible to him, are mumbled over his child. If one religion only were allowed in England, the government would very possibly become arbitrary. If there were but two, the people would cut one another's throats. But as there are such a multitude, they all live happy and in peace." Voltaire's message is clear. Religious differences are trivial and separate men, while trade is important and brings them together. His conclusion that the plurality of religions in England leads to a more peaceful society is, of course, a covert criticism of France, where the Catholic Church was so dominant. The Letters Concerning the English Nation also discuss Locke and Newton, thinkers then poorly known in France. The subject matter might seem challenging, but Voltaire is a past master at popularizing difficult material. Ask any school child today what they know about Newton, and they'll tell you about the apple falling on his head, and the survival of this anecdote is due entirely to Voltaire. He heard it from Newton's niece and immediately understood that this simple, homely image was the perfect way of conveying the simplicity of Newton's explanation of the force of gravity. After Voltaire used the story in his letters concerning the English nation, everyone remembered it, and Voltaire left his mark on English popular culture. Voltaire struggled with the question of good and evil, the problem at the heart of his best-known work, Candide, which was published in 1759 and was a bestseller from the moment it appeared. Translated into every possible language, it remains the most widely read work of the European Enlightenment. It's even left its mark on our language. Expressions like pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others, or il faut cultiver le jardin, we must cultivate our garden, have entered common usage. In the best of all possible worlds, yes, that's another one, speakers of French or English quote Candide without even realizing it. And that's the sure mark of a classic. Candide is a timeless work, a satire of the human condition. But it's also a work of the Enlightenment, and its philosophical theme is announced in the title, Candide or Optimism. The hero of Candide, as his name tells us, is an innocent anti-hero. He is enthralled to his tutor, Pangloss, who preaches the philosophy of optimism. This is not optimism in the modern sense of looking on the bright side. Optimism, spelt with a capital O, and as expounded by the German philosopher Leibniz, was an attempt to answer the age-old problem of evil. Why, if God is good, does he permit the existence of evil in the world? To which the 18th century Leibnizian optimist replies, evil is all part of some greater pattern of good. All partial evil, universal good, as the English poet Pope put it. In other words, evil doesn't really exist at all. It's just something which man imagines because of his limited view of the world. You might think this sounds like a bit of a confidence trick, and Voltaire certainly did. But this idea did find widespread acceptance in the 18th century. Candide's great mission was to put this philosophy to the test. Ejected from his comfortable home in an obscure German castle after trying to seduce the baron's beautiful daughter Cunégonde, Voltaire's hero Candide undergoes many trials and tribulations. Conscripted into the army, he fights in a war, then deserts, only to find himself a witness to an earthquake in Lisbon. Candide is repeatedly brought face to face with evil in its most extreme forms. Moral evil in the case of the earthquake, where man is not apparently to blame, and most of all human evil, such as a war where man is very definitely to blame. Pangloss's breezy optimism is clearly an inadequate response to enormities of evil on this scale. Eventually, even Candide comes to realize this. To quote from the book, and sometimes Pangloss would say to Candide, all events form a chain in the best of all possible worlds, for in the end, if you'd not been given a good kick up the backside and chased out of a beautiful castle for loving Miss Cunégonde, and if you hadn't been subjected to the Inquisition, and if you hadn't wandered about America on foot, and if you hadn't dealt the Baron a good blow with your sword, and if you hadn't lost all your sheep from that fine country of El Dorado, you wouldn't be here now eating candied citron and pistachio nuts. That is well put, replied Candide. But we must cultivate our garden. After 1760, Voltaire took up residence in the chateau at Ferney, just outside Geneva. By now, he was the most famous living writer in Europe, and he became widely known as the patriarch of Ferney. He took up a number of public causes. In 1761, a Protestant merchant, Jean Calas, was accused of murdering his son and sentenced by the judges of Toulouse to be tortured and then broken on the wheel. The legal processes were, to say the least, irregular, and the suspicion grew that the judges in this Catholic city had acted with excessive zeal out of religious bigotry. Voltaire became involved in the case and mounted an energetic campaign to rehabilitate Calas's memory and help the members of his family who'd been left destitute. He wrote letters to those in authority and published a stream of pamphlets, culminating in 1763 in his Traité sur la tolérance, which begins with the historical facts of the Calas case and broadens out into a history of religious intolerance in European culture. Voltaire's writings had enormous impact on public opinion, and eventually the judges in Paris quashed the judgment of the Toulouse court. Too late to save Calas, but a huge victory for Voltaire, who'd learnt an important lesson about how change could be brought about through the pressure of public opinion. Opinion rules the world, he wrote in 1764, but in the long run, it's the philosophers who shape this opinion. Voltaire said of himself that he wrote to act, and he wanted his writings to change the way people thought and behaved. In leading his crusades against fanaticism, he even invented a campaign slogan, écraser l'infâme, which translates roughly as crush the despicable. L'infâme stands here for everything that Voltaire hated, everything that he had spent his life fighting: superstition, intolerance, irrational behaviour of every kind. We should never forget that Voltaire was also a brilliant writer, one of the greatest stylists the French language has ever known. The power of his ideas had a lot to do with the power of his expression. Many writers made fun of miracles. No one did so as hilariously as Voltaire. Always Voltaire had an ear for the telling phrase, "If God had not existed, it would have been necessary to invent him." It's a good line, even in English, and better still in the original French, where it's more memorable because it's a classical Alexandrine line in 12 syllables. Si Dieu n'existait pas, il faudrait l'inventer. Voltaire's legacy in our present debates about religious toleration remain extremely potent. Hardly a week passes without an article in the press quoting, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." This rallying cry of tolerant multiculturalism is so potent that if Voltaire hadn't said it, we would have had to invent it. Which is what happened. The expression was invented by an English woman in 1906. No matter, it expresses a truth which is fundamentally important to our culture, so we have adopted the phrase and decided that Voltaire said it. Voltaire's name has become synonymous with a set of liberal values: freedom of speech, rejection of bigotry and superstition, belief in reason and tolerance. It's a unique and nowadays extremely precious legacy.